All right, fifth grade, we're finished with World War II. What we get into today is from the time period of about 1945, which is right when World War II ended, up until 1962. This is like the start of the Cold War. So, just like after World War I, Germany loses with the Axis powers. The winning countries then form some sort of treaty to make the losing countries agree to certain terms and conditions. And part of that is reparations and things like that. Now, there is one thing that's a little bit different after World War II, is you have Russia and the United States, which were on the same side of this war, but had two total different philosophies about how to rebuild Europe. Since there's so much fighting going on in all these different countries, lots of destruction and death, and people's homes and communities are destroyed. And so there needs to be this rebuilding process of all of those nations. The United States thinks capitalism is the way to go, where USSR, Soviet Russia, thinks communism is the way to go. So the Cold War is basically a battle between the United States and Russia to see who can spread their influence to the most countries. Both sides want their form of government to prevail. So that's what we'll focus on today, the start of the Cold War. All right, Americans Face Changes is the topic of our chapter, and we have the Cold War as our topic of study for today, the start of the Cold War. Our objectives: explain economic and political differences between the United States and Soviet Union, and identify significant Cold War events, including the Berlin Airlift, the Korean War, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. So like I said, you have the two world superpowers after World War II, United States and USSR, Soviet Russia. Now, after World War II, they fought this Cold War, not fighting with weapons physically and killing soldiers, but more a battle of intelligence and influence. They both wanted to spread their form of government to the rest of the world as Europe rebuilt. So the Soviet Union, write down these two forms of government. They had communism. That's where the government controls production and owns the nation's natural and capital resources. So in this form of government, you would have Russia owning most or all of the nation's companies. So there aren't many things that are privately owned. It's all owned by the government. So like Amazon would be owned by the United States government, and they would determine how that company is run and things like that. Whereas in the United States, we had capitalism. In capitalism, you had a totally different form of government where ordinary people and businesses control the production of goods and services. So almost everything in America is privately owned. You have a few things that the government runs, like the U.S. Postal Service is owned by the government and run by the government, and certain natural resources the government has control over, but most things are privately owned. And so in a capitalism government, people have more freedom to decide for themselves where to live, what work to do, and things are produced based on the demand for them, instead of things being produced in communism based on what the government needs to tell you to produce. So the Cold War begins. In the background, you have kind of an illustration of the Cold War spreading influence, where the communist influence was, which is mostly in the eastern part of our world, and then where the capitalist view was spread, which is the rest of it. So the Soviet Union, they set up communist governments all over Eastern Europe, and China also set up a communist government. Our president at the time, the one who dropped both atomic bombs, Harry S. Truman, he thought, along with many others in America, it's a very popular opinion, that the spread of communism is a threat to freedom. Communism is the opposite of what America is about. So after World War II, the Soviet Union controlled the eastern half of Germany. The US and Britain and France controlled the western half of Germany. So if you look at this map, this shows you the different colors. So America was kind of in control of this section of Europe, not like we were colonizing them, but more we were in charge of helping them rebuild and set up their own governments. And then you have Britain in charge of the green part, and then you have France in charge of this blue part. And then the red is Russia, Soviet Union, Russia. Now, if you look closely, you can see here like a rainbow deal where you have America, you have Britain, and you have France and Russia. This is Berlin. So within Germany, you have it split between communist and capitalist views. And so this becomes a big issue. What you have is Russia controlling all of this, and they basically wanted to take the rest of Berlin for themselves to make it communist. The way they did this is they told these nations, we are not going to allow you to get any supplies in to your part of Berlin because you'd be trespassing on our land. And so they would not allow cars or anything to come through here. So we come up with a plan. Instead of driving through, because we're not allowed to, we're going to send airplanes in and drop supplies down into our part of Berlin to help the people there. And so the United States, Great Britain, and France, that's what they decided to do. They send in planes with all sorts of supplies to the city to help the people there. Now, in 1961, the Soviets, they build a Berlin Wall, this giant concrete wall to split Berlin in two. Now, you may think they're doing this to keep the Americans out of East Berlin. Actually, what it did was it kept the people in East Berlin out, or it kept the people in East Berlin from leaving. It was more like a cage for the people on the communist side of Berlin than it was a fence keeping the people from the capitalist side out. So really this wall trapped in the people who lived in the Russian-controlled part of Berlin. And so it divides communist Berlin from the rest of the city. In 1945, the United Nations, they try to make and keep peace. So they were formed so that there's not another world war that comes out of this. Here's another map. You can see the Warsaw Pact is this pink. These are all communist countries that are all like together, that kind of form the Soviet Union. They adopt communist point of views, and then these yellow countries are also communist. And then NATO countries are countries that joined in they're kind of like allies, trade partners that are capitalist. You have non-communist countries not in NATO, so capitalist countries like Spain that were not in the agreement. All right, more Cold War conflicts. Now, there are little wars that come about because of the bigger Cold War. For example, in Korea, you have North Korea, which has China's communist influence, and South Korea, which wants to remain capitalist. North Korea communist, South Korea not communist. And so North Korea invades South Korea in 1950. Their goal is to turn the entire peninsula into one communist country. We help. We have General Douglas MacArthur, who leads the UN Army, so an army made up of all sorts of different nations to help South Korea keep their independence. The United States sent most of the soldiers over there, and North Korea received help from China in this fight. By the end of this, you have hundreds of thousands of soldiers that are dying in battle, and a lot of them American soldiers too. And so this war becomes unpopular in the U.S. You have many people wondering why we are sending United States troops all the way to the other side of the world to fight for a country that isn't ours. And so in 1953, the war ended. Neither side won. And Korea is still divided to this day. There's another video for you to watch today about the demilitarized zone right here, DMZ, about the split between North and South Korea. Pretty interesting to this day. Another thing that starts is an arms race. You can write that down. So a contest between nations to get bigger and more powerful weapons. This happens between the United States and Russia. Soviet Union and the U.S., they stockpiled lots of atomic bombs. And so the goal was you wanted to have more than the other guy. Now, the problem that comes with this is that when you have all these nuclear weapons, if there's a fighting that breaks out and they get used, that'll probably be the end of the whole world as we know it. Not just from the explosions, but from the radiation as well. And so in 1959, you have Fidel Castro in Cuba, and the Soviet Union, they're helping Cuba set up a communist government. Now, America doesn't like this, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But first, here's Korea. So this is the start of the Korean War, and then as it goes on. And this is where it is now. The lines are drawn. You can see North and South Korea at nighttime. South Korea is all lit up, North Korea is all dark. That's because North Korea has no energy. All their people are so poor that they don't have lights at night. And so you can see one little speck compared to South Korea. And so that's kind of one reason that the United States wanted to stop the spread of communism, because they saw that it usually doesn't work very well, and they didn't want that to be happening to a lot of the world. Look at how close Cuba is to the United States. That's why we're kind of nervous. If you have Russia with all these nuclear weapons and Cuba, which is really close to Florida, you can see why we're not very comfortable about Cuba being there. So that leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, the Soviet Union was secretly sending missiles to Cuba, which you can see can easily attack most of the United States from there. And so you have President John F. Kennedy that orders a blockade of Cuba. Nothing went in or out. We had them surrounded. And after 6 days, the Soviet Union agreed to take their missiles out of Cuba, the missiles that they said they never sent to Cuba. And so the U.S. lifted the blockade. And so the Cuban Missile Crisis was basically everyone in America freaking out about the possibility that we could get attacked. So in different towns, you had like nuclear bomb drills, kind of like how we have tornado drills or fire drills. They would have drills where the Russians are bombing us, and everyone would take cover. All right, in summary, Cold War between the superpowers of the Soviet Union and the United States began soon after World War II. During the Berlin airlift, the United States, Britain, and France flew food and supplies into West Berlin. And in 1950, North Korea and China fought the United States and UN forces in the Korean War. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis could have led to a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States. One question to think about: what were some differences between the United States and the USSR? Fifth grade, that's a lot of stuff to get through in just one lesson. Now, that was just the start of the Cold War. Cold War goes all the way to the 80s till President Reagan, till President Bush Sr., until the Soviet Union collapses. So we'll go back to it throughout this chapter and actually in next chapter too. But that's just the start of the Cold War. There are two other videos for you to view, one on the demilitarized zone in Korea, which is super interesting, and then one on the Berlin airlift. Blessings on your day.